I trained the man who replaced me. I answered his questions, fixed his mistakes, and showed him every system that kept the company alive. When they told me he was taking my role, I nodded, shook his hand, and never warned him what was coming next. If you've ever been quietly replaced, used, or erased after giving your best, take a moment to like, comment, or share this story. You're not alone. I was never the loudest person in the room. Not at work, not in my family, not even among friends. I learned early that volume didn't equal value and that the people who talked the most were rarely the ones holding things together. I was the one who stayed. At the company, my title was Operations Manager, but that barely scratched the surface of what I did. I built workflows from chaos. I created documentation no one asked for, but everyone relied on. When something broke at 2 a.m., I was the one who answered the call, not because it was written in my contract, but because if I didn't, everything would stall by morning. At home, the pattern was the same. My parents were aging, and somehow that responsibility landed quietly in my lap. I handled medical appointments, insurance paperwork, repairs around the house. My younger brother Daniel had charm and opinions, but not availability. My older sister lived in another city and called often, mostly to tell me what I should be doing better. No one ever said, "We expect you to carry this." They didn't have to. Expectations settle into silence, the same way dust does, slowly, invisibly, until you realize you're breathing it every day. I didn't resent it. Not at first. There's a strange comfort in being dependable. People stop questioning your value when you prove you're necessary. Or at least, that's what I believed. At work, my direct supervisor, Mark, used words like rock solid and indispensable. He'd say them casually. In meetings, as if tossing crumbs of validation was enough to sustain someone who'd built the entire table. "You're the backbone here," he once said, clapping my shoulder. I smiled. I always smiled. What I didn't realize then was that people don't protect backbones. They lean on them until something else looks easier. The company itself was growing fast, too fast. We were expanding teams, onboarding new clients, patching systems that should have been rebuilt years ago. And because I understood the infrastructure better than anyone else, every decision eventually passed through me. I trained new hires. I corrected senior leadership's assumptions without embarrassing them. I translated executive ambition into operational reality. When deadlines were missed, I absorbed the frustration quietly. When successes happened, my name rarely appeared in the summary email. That was fine. Or so I told myself. At home, the dynamic mirrored it perfectly. Family group chats buzzed with opinions and complaints, but when something actually needed to be done, the silence stretched until I stepped in. "Can you handle it? Can you check on them? You're better at these things." I was better at these things because I never said no. My wife, Lena, noticed before I did. She'd watch me answer work emails at the dinner table, family calls during weekends, emergencies that always seemed to find me. "You're allowed to take up space," she said once, gently. "I do," I replied, just quietly. She didn't argue. She knew I wouldn't hear it yet. Emotionally, there was an imbalance I pretended not to see. People came to me when they needed something: clarity, stability, solutions, but rarely asked how much weight I was already carrying. I became the container for everyone else's chaos. And when you become a container long enough, people stop seeing you as human. You become infrastructure, replaceable, upgradable, invisible until failing. The first sign should have been how meetings changed. I was still invited, but my role shifted. Less "what do you think?" and more "can you explain this?" My contributions were treated like utilities: useful, necessary, but not strategic. Then came the announcement. We were bringing in additional leadership support. That's how Mark phrased it. Casual, almost cheerful. A new role designed to scale operations and support cross-team alignment. Support me, I assumed. I didn't object when they asked me to help onboard him. Of course I didn't. That was my role, to make things work. His name was Eric, early 30s. Confident in the way people are when they haven't yet been tested. He had the right degree, the right vocabulary, and just enough humility to appear curious rather than threatening. "I'm excited to learn from you," he said on his first day, and I believed him. I showed him everything. Not because I was careless, but because I was thorough. I walked him through processes, dependencies, decision trees. I explained not just what we did, but why. I gave him the context that made the system make sense. He took notes, asked smart questions, thanked me often. At home, things continued as usual. More responsibility, more expectation, less acknowledgement. A relative needed financial advice. Another needed help navigating a dispute. Daniel called to ask if I could handle something quick for our parents. I did, always. What I didn't notice was how familiar this pattern felt. Training Eric wasn't just part of my job. It was the same role I'd been playing my whole life. The steady hand. The quiet support. The one who prepares others to step forward. And the one who is rarely asked whether he wants to keep standing in the background. There was no sense of danger yet. No anger. No betrayal. Just a subtle shift in gravity. People leaned on me a little less and relied on Eric a little more. Not because he was better, but because he was new, visible, freshly endorsed by leadership. I told myself this was growth. That mentorship was a form of legacy. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that I wasn't training a teammate. I was training my replacement. And everyone around me already knew. The moment didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices. No heated meeting. No warning signs flashing red. It arrived as a calendar notification. Quick sync, 15 minutes. Mark's name was on it. HR was added as an optional attendee. That alone told me more than the meeting ever would. I didn't rush. I finished the report I was working on, saved my notes, and joined exactly on time. The camera flickered on. Mark was already there, sitting straighter than usual. The HR representative smiled politely, the kind of smile trained to reveal nothing. Eric wasn't on the call. That should have been my first confirmation. Thanks for joining on short notice, Mark said. His tone was light, professional, almost rehearsed. I'll get straight to it. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I learned long ago that nodding makes people underestimate how closely you re-listening. We've been reviewing our operational structure, he continued. And as part of a broader realignment, we've decided to move in a slightly different direction. Different direction. That phrase is designed to avoid responsibility. Effective next month, he said, we'll be transitioning Eric into a lead operational role. He paused, watching my face. I didn't react. And your position, he added carefully, will be rescoped. More advisory, less day-to-day ownership. Rescoped, another safe word. So I'm being moved out, I said calmly, not phrasing it as a question. Mark smiled, relieved I'd done the translation for him. Not out, just repositioned. We value your institutional knowledge. Institutional knowledge, not leadership, not authority. Memory. I glanced at the HR representative. She was already typing. When was this decided? I asked. There, it was the only crack in the script. Mark hesitated. Just a second. But enough. We've been discussing it for a while, he said. You know how these things evolve. I did know. They evolve quietly, behind closed doors, long before the person affected is invited into the conversation. And Eric? I asked, when did he know? Another pause. He's aware of the transition, Mark said. We thought it made sense for you to help him ramp up. That was the betrayal, not the decision itself, but the assumption. They had already decided, already informed him, and still expected me to continue transferring power. I didn't realize I was losing. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not hurt. Clarity. Understood, I said. HR looked surprised. Mark looked relieved. We really appreciate your professionalism, he said. And of course, we'll need your support over the next few weeks to ensure continuity. Support. Always that word. I'll do what's required, I replied. Carefully chosen. Non-committal. Accurate. The call ended. No conflict. No raised voices. Just a quiet removal. I sat there for a moment, after the screen went dark, hands resting on the desk, breathing evenly. This wasn't an emotional ambush. It was a logistical one. At home that evening, the pattern repeated almost mockingly. My sister called. Heard from Mum that there might be some changes at work. She said, you should really think about stability at your age. I didn't ask how she knew. Information always travels faster than respect. I'm handling it, I said. Well, just make sure you're still available, she replied. You know how much everyone depends on you. There it was again. Dependence without consent. Later, Daniel messaged, can you still help me with that thing next month? Even if work gets busy. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Busy. They assumed I'd be busier helping others than myself. At work, Eric's behavior shifted immediately. Not aggressively. That would have required courage. Instead, he grew confident in subtle ways. Spoke first in meetings. Reframed my suggestions in his own words. Asked fewer questions, especially the important ones. I noticed leadership responding differently. Nods. Affirmations. Compliments for ideas I recognized as mine, now wearing his voice. And the strangest part. No one looked at me when it happened. It's easier to erase someone when you don't meet their eyes. I continued my role without protest. Documented processes, answered questions, smoothed transitions. Not because I was loyal, but because I was observant. People mistake silence for surrender. What they don't realize is that silence is often reconnaissance. One afternoon, Eric stopped by my desk. "Hey," he said, casual. "Mark mentioned you might step back soon. I just wanted to say I really appreciate everything you've taught me." It sounded sincere. Maybe it even was. "You're doing fine," I replied. He hesitated. "If there's anything else I should know, any landmines, you can tell me." I looked at him then. Really looked. At the confidence, the assumption, the belief that knowledge was something you could simply transfer, like files between systems. "No," I said gently. "You've got it covered." And that was the moment. The silent decision. I would give him exactly what he had been given. No more, no less, no warnings, no context beyond what was already documented, no emotional labor, no protective instincts. I would stop being the buffer. I didn't sabotage. I didn't withhold information that was formally required. I didn't lie. I simply stopped compensating for decisions that weren't mine anymore. At home, the same shift began. When requests came, I responded slower, asked questions instead of solving, redirected responsibility without explanation. There was pushback, of course, confusion, mild irritation, accusations of distance. But no one asked why. They never do when entitlement feels normal. By the end of that week, everything looked the same on the surface. Same meetings, same emails, same routines. But underneath, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer invested in holding up systems that had quietly decided I was optional. I was still calm, still professional, still dependable on paper, but internally, I had stepped back. And once you do that, once you stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices, the collapse doesn't need your help anymore. The first cracks appeared quietly, the way structural problems always do. A missed deadline here, a confused email chain there. Small things easy to dismiss, easier to excuse. At first, no one panicked. They rarely do when the damage is still abstract. Eric blamed legacy complexity. Mark nodded sympathetically. Leadership reassured each other that transitions always came with friction. And every time a question circled the room, it drifted almost instinctively back toward me. "Can you take a quick look? Do you remember how this used to work? Maybe you can clarify what's happening here." I answered, when asked briefly, precisely, without urgency. What I didn't do was step in early. I didn't preempt confusion. I didn't smooth rough edges before they became visible. I waited until someone officially owned the problem before acknowledging it existed. That was new, and people felt it immediately. "You seem less involved," Mark said, during a one-on-one. His tone was neutral, but his posture wasn't. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, as if proximity could re-establish control. "I'm aligned with my updated scope," I replied. Calm, factual. He frowned slightly. "Yes, but your experience is still available," I finished. When requested. He didn't like that answer. It removed ambiguity. And ambiguity was how they'd operated. Soon, the tone shifted. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration into implication. During a meeting, Eric stumbled through a process explanation and glanced at me halfway through, expecting rescue. I didn't offer it. I waited. Afterward, someone messaged me privately. "Why didn't you jump in? You knew where he was going wrong." I typed, deleted, then sent a single line. He didn't ask. That was when the narrative began to change. I became distant, checked out, not as collaborative as before. It was subtle, but intentional. A way to recast my restraint as a flaw. Gaslighting rarely announces itself. It rewrites history instead. At home, the same escalation unfolded. My sister called again, this time sharper. "You've been harder to reach," she said. "Mom feels like you don't care as much anymore." I pictured my mother, confused by shifting dynamics she didn't create. "I still care," I said. "I'm just not available the same way." "Well, that's not fair," she snapped. "We've always relied on you." There it was again. Reliance presented as entitlement. "I didn't say it was fair," I replied. "I said it was different." She didn't respond well to that. Neither did my brother, who began sending passive-aggressive messages when I asked him to handle things himself. "Never mind. I'll figure it out. Guess everyone's busy these days." They wanted guilt. I gave them silence. Back at work, the consequences grew harder to ignore. A client escalation reached leadership directly, something that had never happened before. The issue traced back to a process Eric had modified without fully understanding downstream effects. Mark called an emergency meeting. "This never used to happen," he said, pacing. "We need to understand what changed." Everyone looked at Eric, then, almost reflexively, at me. "Well," Eric said carefully, "the system was complex, and some of the documentation didn't fully reflect real-world dependencies. That was clever, not a lie but incomplete." Mark turned to me. "Is that true?" I met his eyes evenly. "The documentation reflects the system as it was designed. Any changes would require updated modeling." A pause. "So you knew this could happen?" Mark asked. There it was. The pivot. The attempt to shift responsibility backward. "I knew what the system required to remain stable," I said. "Those requirements haven't changed." The room was quiet. No accusation. No defense. Just clarity. After the meeting, HR reached out not formally, but casually. A check-in disguised as concern. "We've noticed some tension," the representative said. "How are you feeling about the transition?" "I'm adjusting," I replied. "Do you feel supported?" I considered the question. "I feel accurately positioned," I said. She blinked, uncertain how to log that response. The truth was, things were falling apart faster than anyone expected, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd stopped doing things that were never officially mine to begin with. Invisible labor has a way of revealing itself only when it's gone. Eric worked longer hours, sent more emails, asked fewer questions. Pride does that. Tick convinces people that asking for help is weakness, and leadership let him struggle. Not out of cruelty, but convenience. Admitting a mistake would have meant admitting they misjudged the transition. So instead, they leaned harder. On him. On me. "You should have flagged this earlier," Mark said one afternoon. "I wasn't asked to review it," I replied. "Well, you could have volunteered." I smiled then. Not sarcastically, not bitterly. "That would have contradicted the new structure," I said. I didn't want to undermine it. He had no response to that. At home, the emotional pressure intensified. My mother asked gently if I was upset with everyone. My sister accused me of being selfish. Daniel stopped calling altogether. It hurt, but not the way betrayal usually does. This pain was clarifying. I began to see how often my presence had prevented consequences from reaching the people who caused them. How often I'd softened landings that were never meant for me. One evening, Lena sat beside me on the couch, watching me scroll through work emails. I no longer felt responsible for fixing. "They're blaming you," she said softly. "I know. And you're letting them." I nodded. She took my hand. "That's new. It's necessary," I said. The final shift came during a leadership review. Metrics were down. Client satisfaction had dipped. Operational delays were stacking. Someone suggested reintegrating my role, not restoring it, just borrowing it back. Mark approached me afterward. "We may need you to step in more actively," he said. "At least temporarily." I looked at him, calm as ever. "Under what authority?" I asked. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything became clear. They wanted my results without my position. My responsibility without my voice. My labor without my consent. And for the first time, I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't miscommunication. This was entitlement. And entitlement doesn't correct itself. It escalates until it crosses a line so clear, so undeniable, that silence becomes a decision, instead of a reaction. That line was closer than any of them realized. The line wasn't crossed in a dramatic moment. There was no shouting. No betrayal delivered face to face. No single sentence that shattered everything. It happened quietly through paperwork. Mark asked me to stop by his office late one afternoon. His tone was unusually gentle, the way people sound when they already know they're asking for too much. "We're under pressure," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Leadership is concerned. Clients are concerned. And frankly, Eric is overwhelmed." I said nothing. "We need stability," he continued. "Just for a while." I waited. "We'd like you to formally sign off on a temporary advisory agreement," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "It gives you authority to intervene where needed without changing the org chart." I picked up the paper. It wasn't advisory. It was liability. The document placed operational responsibility squarely on me: compliance, oversight, risk acceptance, final approval, authority while keeping Eric's title intact. My name at the bottom. His at the top. "So you want me to carry the risk?" I said calmly. "Without the role." "It's temporary," Mark replied quickly. "Just until things stabilize." I flipped to the last page. There it was. A clause stating that any failures during this period would be reviewed under my prior role, history, my institutional knowledge. They weren't just asking me to help. They were preparing to blame me. That was the moment something hardened inside me, not anger, not resentment. Finality. I'll need time to review this, I said. Mark nodded, relieved. Of course. But we're hoping to move quickly. I stood, thanked him, and left the office, without another word. At home, I read the document again slowly, carefully. Lena watched my face change as I reached the end. They're trying to protect themselves, she said. Yes, I replied. At my expense. This isn't just work anymore, she added. She was right. Because later that night, my phone rang again. Family. My sister, this time voice tight, impatient. Why didn't you tell us your job was at risk? She demanded. Mom's worried. I didn't think it was necessary, I said. Well, now it is, she snapped. We're already dealing with enough. You can't just check out when people need you. I closed my eyes briefly. I'm not checking out, I said. I'm setting limits. She laughed, actually laughed. You don't get to do that, she said. Not now. Not when everyone's counting on you. There it was. The same expectation. Different arena. I realized then that this wasn't about a company, or a promotion, or even betrayal. It was about access. Everyone believed they had automatic access to my labor, my time, my competence, because I had never denied it before. At work, they wanted my accountability without authority. At home, they wanted my support without respect. Different systems. Same entitlement. The next morning, Eric sent me a message. Hey, Mark mentioned you might be stepping in more formally again. I think that'll really help. No acknowledgement of what it cost me. No awareness of the trap being built around us both. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the document to a lawyer. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Just methodically. That afternoon, HR followed up. We'll need your decision by end of week, the representative said. I won't be signing, I replied. There was a pause. May I ask why? You're asking me to assume responsibility without authority, I said. That violates professional standards. Well, she said carefully. Refusing to support the transition could reflect negatively. There it was. The threat softened, but unmistakable. Please document that, I said. Silence. I'd like it noted, I continued, that I was asked to assume risk without role alignment, and declined. Her tone changed immediately. I'll make a note. That evening, I visited my parents. I hadn't planned to, but something told me this conversation needed to happen in person. My mother looked tired, confused by the tension she felt, but didn't understand. You're okay, aren't you? She asked. I am, I said, but things are going to change. My sister crossed her arms. We just need you to stay consistent. No, I replied calmly. You need to adjust. The room went quiet. I've spent years absorbing responsibility, so no one else had to feel discomfort. I continued. That ends now. Daniel scoffed. So what, we're just supposed to pick up everything? Yes, I said. What's yours? My sister shook her head. This isn't like you. I know, I said. That's the point. No yelling. No accusation. Just a boundary stated aloud for the first time. And in that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. They weren't angry because I was wrong. They were angry because I was no longer available to be used. Back at work, the pressure intensified. Mark called again. If this fails, he said quietly, it will affect everyone. I looked at him. You already decided whose fault it would be, I said. Just not openly. He didn't deny it. That was the final line. Not the demotion, not the replacement, not even the gaslighting, but the willingness across every part of my life to sacrifice my well-being to preserve their comfort. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was clear, and clarity doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs to stop cooperating. Quiet justice doesn't arrive with satisfaction at first. It arrives with paperwork, patience, and restraint. After declining the agreement, I didn't argue, I didn't threaten, I didn't escalate emotionally. I did exactly what I'd always done, best documented reality. Every request from leadership was answered in writing. Every scope clarification was confirmed by email. Every responsibility I was asked to assume was mapped against my official role, and politely declined if it fell outside it. Not with defiance. With precision. I requested updated job descriptions. I asked for formal approval chains. I stopped acting on verbal assurances. What surprised them most wasn't my refusal, it was my consistency. There was no crack to exploit. No emotional lever to pull. Eric struggled openly now. Issues that once vanished quietly began surfacing in dashboards, client escalations, and audit logs. He wasn't incompetent, just exposed. Systems I had once stabilized instinctively now behaved exactly as designed. Dependencies failed when ignored. Safeguards triggered when bypassed. Warnings appeared in reports leadership had never bothered to read before, and because I hadn't sabotaged anything, no one could accuse me of causing it. I simply let reality speak. One morning, Ligo requested a meeting. Not confrontational. Curious. They wanted to understand why certain risks were flagged, but unresolved. I brought emails, timelines, signed approvals. Here's where the responsibility shifted, I said calmly. And here's where I was asked to carry it again without authority. They nodded, took notes. No drama, just alignment. At home, the shift was quieter, but just as profound. When my sister called with another urgent request, I didn't refuse. I asked questions. Who else is involved? What have you already tried? What happens if I don't intervene? She didn't like those questions. They forced ownership back onto her. Daniel eventually showed up punctually. Showed up to help our parents. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but present. My mother stopped calling me first. She started calling everyone. The world didn't collapse. That was the most revealing part. At work, the consequences accelerated. A major client requested a review. Formal external auditors examined operational changes made during the transition. The findings were neutral but clear. Insufficient oversight, misaligned authority, risk acceptance without accountability. No names, just facts. Leadership panicked quietly. Mark scheduled another meeting. This time, HR and legal were present. We'd like to revisit your role, he said carefully. I waited. There may be an opportunity to restore certain authorities, he added, with revised compensation. I smiled, not out of victory, but understanding. You're offering authority now, I said, because the risk has become visible. He didn't argue. But the structure, I continued, still places responsibility unevenly, and I'm no longer willing to compensate for that. Silence. What would you propose? Legal asked. I proposed alignment, I replied. Or separation. No threat, no demand, just clarity. They asked for time. I gave it to them. In the meantime, Eric resigned. Not dramatically, just quietly. He cited burnout, misalignment, a desire to explore other opportunities. No one blamed him publicly. But privately, the narrative shifted. He wasn't ready. He lacked depth. He underestimated complexity. The same things that would have been said about MIF. I had signed that document. Leadership never acknowledged that part. They didn't have to. The company restructured again, this time more cautiously. External consultants were brought in. Authority lines were redrawn. Budgets tightened. And my position? I declined the revised offer. Instead, I negotiated an exit clean, lawful, respectful, severance aligned with my documented contributions. A neutral reference. No non-compete that limited my future. They agreed. Because by then, they understood something fundamental. I wasn't asking. I was concluding. At home, boundaries settled into routine. Requests came less frequently. When they did, they came with respect. My sister stopped assuming. Daniel stopped deflecting. My parents adjusted. Not perfectly, but honestly. I didn't announce my boundaries. I enforced them quietly. That was the real justice. Not seeing anyone fall, but seeing myself no longer required to hold them up. On my last day at work, Mark stopped by my desk. I wish things had gone differently, he said. They did go differently, I replied. Just not the way you planned. He nodded. I underestimated you, he admitted. No, I said gently. You misunderstood silence. I walked out without applause, without speeches, and without regret. Because the justice wasn't in watching them struggle. It was in knowing I'd stopped sacrificing myself to preserve systems that didn't respect me. And once you do that, once you step out of the role everyone assigned you without your consent, life begins to reorganize itself around your actual worth. Quietly, naturally. I didn't need revenge. I needed alignment. And when alignment returned, peace followed. The quiet after leaving was unfamiliar. For years, my days had been shaped by urgency messages, waiting, problems unfolding, people needing something fixed. When that stopped, it felt less like freedom and more like standing in a room where the noise had just been turned off. At first, I didn't rush to replace it. I woke up without an alarm, took long walks in the mornings, let my thoughts surface without forcing them back into usefulness. That's when I realized how deeply my identity had been tied to being needed, not respected, not valued, needed. There's a difference. Being needed makes you useful to others. Being respected makes you whole to yourself. I hadn't been whole in a long time. Professionally, I took my time. I didn't announce a comeback. I didn't update my profile immediately. I spoke selectively to people who understood systems, ethics, and boundaries. When opportunities came, I evaluated them differently. I asked about decision rights before responsibilities. I asked how failure was handled, not just success. I asked who carried risk and who absorbed blame. Some conversations ended quickly. That told me everything I needed to know. Eventually, I accepted a role not as an employee, but as an independent consultant. Short-term engagements, clearly defined scope, written authority, clean exits, no ambiguity. Clients respected me more because they had to. I respected myself because I chose it. At home, the transformation was quieter but deeper. My sister stopped calling to instruct me. She started asking, sometimes awkwardly, what I thought. Daniel learned, slowly, that avoidance had consequences. Not punishment, just responsibility. My parents adjusted, not because they were forced to, but because the old patterns no longer worked. And I let go of the guilt. That was the hardest part. Guilt doesn't come from doing something wrong. It comes from breaking a role you were praised for playing. The good son, the reliable one, the team player. Those labels are seductive. They sound like honor, but they're often just permission for others to stop carrying their share. I didn't become colder, I became clearer. When people tested the boundary because they always do, I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I simply didn't move it, and something unexpected happened. The people who valued me adapted. The people who only used me drifted away. Both outcomes felt like relief. Sometimes, I thought about Eric, not with resentment, but with understanding. He hadn't stolen anything from me. He'd stepped into a role built on invisible labor and discovered, too late, that visibility doesn't equal stability. I'd once mistaken the same thing. The company moved on. So did my family. So did I, but the lesson stayed. Silence is not weakness. Calm is not compliance. And patience is not permission. People will assume access to your strength for as long as you allow it. They'll call it loyalty. They'll call it love. They'll call it teamwork. Until the moment you stop. Then they'll call it betrayal. But it isn't. It's self-respect arriving late yet right on time. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't even win by proving I was right. I won by no longer participating in my own erasure. That's the kind of revenge no one sees coming, because it doesn't announce itself. It just changes the rules. Quietly, if this story resonated with you, if you've ever been replaced, used, or expected to carry more than your share, share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else find clarity sooner than you did. And if you want more stories about betrayal, boundaries, and quiet justice, subscribe to the channel, because the most powerful revenge is becoming someone no one gets to misuse again.